All right, welcome to week 5. This week we're going to look at the origins of civilization in Mesopotamia. So we're going to begin to look at the very first civilization in the world, and we're going to see how cities developed and other remarkable achievements during what's known as the Uruk period. So over 5,000 years ago. Last time we were finishing up looking at the Ubaid period. This sets the foundation for what comes later in Mesopotamia. Now, let's take a look at a little bit of the anthropology and the sort of theoretical perspective on leadership and power and how these complex societies emerge. One of the things I like about studying ancient civilizations is a lot of times they give us insight into the current world. So if you understand how leaders in ancient society operated, it gives you an understanding of how leaders today work as well. But in order to make sense of power of some of these leaders, anthropologists kind of identify different forms of power. And like we saw in chiefdoms, you have economic, you have ideological, and you have military power. Well, within the realm of economic power, we talked about prestige goods, and we also talked about tribute of foodstuffs. An anthropologist by the name of Timothy Earle calls that calling up and tribute of foodstuffs staple finance, right? That is, you're financing yourself in the form of staple crops. And many chiefdoms work this way, like Hawaii, which we already saw before. So they would, either call up or extract, right? Influence farmers to give them surplus food. And then they would use that surplus food to hire craft specialists, to hire workers, things like that. A lot of times the way they would do that would be in the context of ideology, right? So you weren't only giving your food to the chief in the sense you were giving your food to the gods as well. We'll see this with Mesopotamia. Now, compared to staple finance, there's also something known as wealth finance, which is what Timothy Earle also talks about. So there, what you're doing is you're trying to have access to exotic trade goods, prestige goods, right? Wealth items. These are things that are, hard to acquire. You can give them as gifts to win supporters. And you also display to people the fact that you have connections outside of that civilization, right? So these are two different forms of power, and you usually see them existing in most societies in different percentages. So one society might be mostly based on the call up of surplus food, and the elites might also have prestige goods. Another society might be focused more on wealth finance, right? So, for example, an example of wealth finance would be some of these kind of early chiefs in Northern Europe, like in Scandinavia. Think of like Beowulf and think of the Vikings. The sort of chief or king, or they were called kings, but you could sort of debate whether they were really kings. But the leaders were, sometimes called by their people the ring givers, because they would get their loyalty or keep the loyalty of their warriors by gift giving, right? Giving them gold, giving them, gold in the form of arm rings and things like that. And that's the way they kept people loyal to them. It was more so that than trying to extract lots of surplus food to work on large projects, which we see in other civilizations. Another sort of dual nature of power is a corporate versus a network strategy. When we talk about corporate, what we mean is group. Network is connections outside of that group. So a corporate strategy would be trying to, a leader trying to improve his status within the community by doing something that shows group membership. So, for example, building a monument within that society and getting people to work on that monument would be kind of a corporate strategy. Trading for exotic items from different civilizations far away, showing that you have a connection to knowledge and people outside of your community would be more of a network strategy. So these are good for identifying different strategies at different times. So, you can ask, okay, was Ubaid focused more on a corporate, or is it focused more on a network strategy? Was the later period focused more on staple finance or wealth finance? You can make the case that Ubaid Mesopotamia was focused more on a corporate strategy. There were trade goods coming in. Not a lot, though, at this time. They were trading with other areas. We'll see we already saw some of that evidence with Tepe-Gawra with the north, right? That shows there probably was some trade. But the building of the temple, is a corporate strategy. Later on, we'll see more of the kind of network strategy of trying to get some of these wealth items. Okay, we said Ubaid is probably a chieftain-level society, although we don't have any identifiable leaders from artwork and things like that. We have large houses. We have grave goods in certain graves. We have depictions of these kind of reptilian people. Maybe they're deities, maybe they're leaders. We're not exactly sure. But it's not as clear as we see in later societies. Okay, the Ubaid culture, especially in terms of the pottery, spreads far and wide. In Tepe-Gawra, we saw that they get not only the Ubaid pottery, but they switch over to Ubaid-style architecture and things like that. Now, in the Persian Gulf, down in Kuwait, we see Ubaid pottery down there. And it looks like, when they've done analysis on the Ubaid pottery, that it is from southern Mesopotamia. Right? That is, they've looked at the clays, they've sourced the clays. These pots actually came from southern Mesopotamia and were traded down into the Persian Gulf and ended up in Kuwait and other Persian Gulf cities. What were the Mesopotamians doing down there? Maybe trading for pearls and other things like that, setting up areas where they could, extract pearls and things like that, get shells from the ocean. And we have model boats showing that boats were probably being used at this time. And there's other evidence that boats are being used, because one of the resources that exists in Mesopotamia, I'll talk a little bit more about this, is a natural petroleum tar or asphalt, like the stuff you see on the roads. Bubbles up in the ground all over the Middle East, especially Iraq, and it was used for waterproofing. Now you have pieces in Kuwait that have impressions of reeds on one side, and on the other side are barnacles. So obviously, whatever this was sitting in the ocean water for a long time, enough that barnacles were forming on the outside. So this is most likely remnants of a reed bundled boat that was waterproofed with this kind of petroleum asphalt, and that was being used for trade in Mesopotamia and also in the Persian Gulf. This is probably what Eridu might have looked like back then. A mixture of mud brick houses and those kind of reed houses, building of reed boats, and using some of that natural asphalt to waterproof the boats so that they could sail out and trade. So we see Ubaid pottery spreading far and wide. In some areas, it's the full complement of the culture: ceramics, temples, house forms, right? And in other areas, it's just the pottery. Was there kind of part of the culture sort of a chiefly ideology? Right, that is, maybe some of these halaf big men adopted Ubaid ideology because it was a new source of prestige and power. that was focused on temples, rather than, we don't really have large temples in halaf communities. We have the tholos and the tholoi, but they're not clearly ritual structures. So maybe these emerging leaders were the ones who adopted Ubaid culture. Right? Okay, so all in all, Ubaid sets the stage for what comes next. And there's a continuity between Ubaid culture and then the next cultures. We see really the beginnings of what we know as Sumeria. Settlement in southern Mesopotamia based on irrigation. We have the beginnings of temples, beginnings of social stratification, trade and contact with the outside area. And these trends take off at an even greater scale in the next period, which we're going to look at now. Now we're going to look at states. We've looked at bands, tribes, and chiefdoms. Now let's look closely at states, because this is what develops in the period we're going to look at this week, which is the Uruk period. Okay. States, when we think of states, we usually think of larger societies than chiefdoms, but they're not just big chiefdoms. Right? You can have a very large chiefdom, but it won't actually be a state. One of the interesting things is when you try and define these things, you're always going to find an exception. So we can say states are usually these kinds of societies, and then there will be a historical example that will be an exception to the rule. So with all of these definitions, they're not hard and fast rules. There's sort of attributes that these societies might have. So states are not just big, right? They are bigger than chiefdoms, much bigger, but they're also diverse internally, right? They're also very stratified, or they tend to be more stratified than chiefdoms. There's a greater potential for the leaders. One, there's a larger society, so there's more labor. But also, a king is usually more powerful than a chief. States are usually also characterized by the presence of cities. And we're going to talk about cities because cities today, represent half of the world's population. Half of the world's population in the world live in cities. We live in state societies today. You really, you can't find a society that is not a state today. Usually a large nation state. You may have a community within that nation state, but the world is essentially divided up into large nation states. States are sometimes characterized by a complex bureaucracy and administration. A lot of people say, I hate bureaucracy. People hate inefficient bureaucracy that doesn't work. But, as we're going to talk about, we need bureaucracy. If people didn't keep records, our society could not function. Even within the university, we need a bureaucracy. If you're a student and you go to student records and you say, I need a transcript, and they say, well, we don't keep transcripts, right? We don't keep that information. Obviously that's not going to work. The registrar keeps a record of, every class you've ever taken. So we need bureaucracy. We need administration. The larger the civilization, the more potential for generating large surplus food, but also a larger labor force. And the ability to organize a large labor force can lead to extraordinary developments. In Egypt, for example, the pyramids. We'll see large monuments in Mesopotamia as well, slightly earlier than in Egypt. So chiefdoms usually have a chief, the nobility, and the majority of the population, which are the workers. Within states, though, you have a lot more specialties. So there's a lot more specialization, and there's also more social stratification in general, and there's also more political centralization. Fewer people having more of the power. Now, this differs, as we're going to see. In different civilizations, you could have a central leader who's relatively weak, and then different group leaders who are fairly strong versus a civilization where the king is the ultimate authority, something like ancient Egypt where the pharaoh was a god, right? So that's showing Egypt up here. The pharaoh is a god and the king at the same time. But, within the state, in Hawaii, you would have craft specialists, you'd have priests, but you would have different kinds of craft specialists within the state. You would also have bureaucrats, scribes. You would have people who would run the court system. You would have marketplaces and people associated with the marketplaces, like different kinds of craft specialists. You would have a hierarchy within the temple administration. So you'd have high priests, lower priests. You'd have a hierarchy within the military. You wouldn't just have warriors, but you'd actually have officers and conscripts and other kinds of ranks. So a state society is not just a very big chiefdom, it's also very diverse within. Now again, cities, this is a picture of Dhaka, which is the most densely populated city in the world today. 50% of the world's population today lives in cities. 75% of the world's GDP, or gross national product, is generated by cities. Cities consume 60% of the world's water, and cities emit 80% of global greenhouse gases. Right? So cities obviously have a tremendous impact on the world today. So by looking at ancient cities, especially in the first cities of Mesopotamia, it helps us sort of understand how cities work. So what is a city? Well, it's one of those things where I know it when I see it. If I have to define it, it maybe isn't as easy. You all know what a city is. If you saw pictures, you could say, yeah, that looks like a city. No, that doesn't look like a city. How would you actually define it, though? Right? Well, a city typically is a large settlement. You'd have several thousand people living in a city. But also, a city is usually defined by large buildings, usually in the city center. Many times they're ritual. They could also be governmental buildings. They could also be marketplaces. It's an area where there's leadership, where there's administration. There's architecture that might restrict activity or restrict access to certain areas. Cities are usually diverse within them. There are different kinds of neighborhoods. Cities usually are not completely self-sufficient. They have to draw in resources from the outside. Cities usually engage in some sort of trade. Right? And cities usually have competing groups within them. Sometimes these groups will have an ideology or some sort of identity that binds them together that's greater than, let's say, their kin group or their tribe, right? So sometimes people believe that cities kind of break some of these lower level loyalties, like loyalty to a clan, loyalty to a tribe, loyalty to a kin group, and replace it, or maybe not completely replace it, but have loyalty to, let's say, some sort of identity, as in we're all citizens of this city, right? For example, in ancient Athens, all youth had to take something known as the Ephebic Oath. It was an oath that they would, make Athens a strong city. They would not leave Athens any less, but rather greater than they found it, right? And that was an oath that was supposed to be stronger than their allegiance to any other kind of group. So usually a large, dense population, organization, non-agricultural activities, and central services of some sort in a city. You'll have specialization. Urbanism is regional, as we're going to see in Mesopotamia. We get to a point where most of the population is living in cities, right? It was a very urban society. So you can have different groups coming in. Some of these different groups, as we'll see in the site of Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, can actually have conflict with each other, and that could lead to problems within the city. But there's usually some sort of urban layout that the built environment will sort of influence how things take place within the society. Now, why do cities grow up in certain areas? That could be a very complicated question. We can look at history, we can look at archaeology, we can look at society today and come up with different reasons why societies will emerge in different areas. We're going to talk a little bit about, American history and why you had certain settlements in the early, English colonies grow up as important cities in the United States. Some of it had to do with geography. That's why Chicago is where it is today, why it became an important city. The actual land that Chicago was built on is not so great. In fact, the Chicago is an indigenous term. I think that means swamp. It wasn't a great area to build a settlement, but it was very strategic in terms of trade. Chicago was at the juncture of the Great Lakes trade routes and then connected via the Illinois River to the Mississippi trade routes connected to the Gulf of Mexico and then the Caribbean and the Atlantic. Right? So Chicago became an important city because of trade and its location along trade routes. The same with many of the cities in the original 13 colonies. Right? So here's a picture of Plymouth. This is one of the earliest settlements by English colonists in North America. Right? Plymouth Rock, we all know that. And here is Manhattan Island. You can see here's the larger map. Here's Manhattan Island right here. Here's Queens. This is where I grew up. This is Brooklyn. This is New Jersey over here. New York became one of the most important cities in the early United States. Plymouth, not so much. Why? Well, when you look at them, Plymouth is right on the coast. It is not a good harbor. Any ship that is along a wharf here is going to get slammed by storms and waves and things like that. Whereas you can see here, Manhattan Island is a perfect harbor because it has an inlet. It's not right up on the ocean. It actually has protection on all sides that allows ships to be protected during storms and things like that. Right? And everyone knows that phrase, we sail with the tide. Getting in and out of harbor was based on the timing of the tides, right? So you would, as the tide was coming in, that would be a good time to enter the harbor. But you would not try and sail against the tide to leave. You'd wait until the tide turned, and then you wouldn't even need to raise your sails until you got out of the harbor. The tide would carry you out, and you would just steer your way out. Right, so harbors were great. You could get in and out of them. They were protected, right? Salem in Massachusetts is another good example of a protected harbor. Salem became a very important trading city in the early colonies. It was the first American colony to trade with China. It became very wealthy. Istanbul, which used to be Constantinople, also, again, very strategic. It connects the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Even today, if you go to Istanbul, you will see all sorts of vessels from different countries going through the Bosphorus to get either to the Black Sea or out to the Mediterranean. Right? If you're in Russia, and you want to access the Mediterranean and countries there, this is the way you go. Same with the Ukraine and you could say Bulgaria, right? Here's Russia, Georgia, right? Lots of different countries border the Black Sea. So this is a very strategic area. Same with the ancient city of Troy. It was on the other end of these straits. And when you look at Troy, here's ancient Troy. In order to access from the Mediterranean the central trade route, you had to go through this area. And typically there are very strong winds here, which meant that as soon as you got around this point, you probably would have to land and wait for the winds to shift before you would make its way up there. This is where Troy was, and Troy grew very wealthy through control of this trade. Right? Okay, so sometimes cities grow up because of trade routes. They grow up in certain areas because they happen to be right on a pass. Or, we talked about this very early on, the first week when we were looking at the role of geography in the Middle East. Sometimes it's the fact that there's great agricultural land and they can support a large population. They grow up because of that. That's one of the things we'll see with Mesopotamia. Maybe there are other resources there, but also it could be the cultural landmarks or ritual areas. Maybe people build a shrine there. The shrine becomes more and more important over time, and maybe that and a combination of other factors attract people to live within that area, and that site becomes larger and larger, and the larger it gets, the greater its ability to attract even more people within, right? An important city is going to attract more people than maybe, let's say, a large town or a small city. Now, some cities show evidence of planning, and many cities do not show evidence of planning. Let's look at a couple of American cities. As we'll see, many cities in Mesopotamia don't show a lot of urban planning. Cities of contemporary civilizations sometimes do, like in the Indus Valley in India and Pakistan. Now, Boston is not a centrally planned city. It grew up slowly over time. It was not laid out at once. It was not organized. You can see the patterns of streets here. They go in all sorts of different directions. And in the 1800s, parts of the harbor were filled in to make more land to grow the city. So this is a great quote from the director of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Right? Boston's early street layout was simply unorganized. People crowded into a small area near the waterfront. They built houses wherever they wanted, and roads emerged among them without any planning. In taverns, he said, people once toasted the crooked little town of Boston. And what this is showing is the orientation of the streets compared to cardinal points north, south, east, west. And the size of the line shows the number of streets or the percentage of streets that orient themselves along different directions. So you can see not so much, lots of different directions here in Boston. Compare that to a city we're more familiar with, like Detroit, where many of the streets align towards the cardinal directions or pretty close to it. Detroit has more of a grid plan. It was laid out more at once. There was more organization and planning involved. Manhattan is laid out in the grid plan, not the original settlement, New Amsterdam, that the Dutch lived in. That was more of a city like Boston. But once the British took control, they then just divided the island up into a grid plan. And you can see, that it makes it easier for other people to navigate. So looking at cities, we could sort of understand if they were organized or not. All right, V. Gordon Childe, who coined that term, the Neolithic Revolution, also coined another term to characterize the next big step in human history, civilization or states. They called it the Urban Revolution. So we're going to look at some of the things that he thought in the 1950s were characteristic of civilizations. And again, wherever there's a rule, you'll find an exception. But we'll talk about that and how it applies to Mesopotamia.